Welcome everyone. Good evening from Jerusalem. The event will begin in roughly 10 minutes. You are more than invited to turn your cameras on. Soon everyone will be able to. Regretfully, we cannot permit opening microphones during the event, but if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat room, and we'll do our best to answer what we can towards the end. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Shalom וערב טוב לכולם, ברוכים הבאים. האירוע יתחיל בעוד כ10 דקות. אתם מוזמנים בהחלט לפתוח מצלמות, בקרוב כולם יוכלו. לצערי לא נוכל לאפשר פתיחת מיקרופונים במהלך האירוע, אבל אם יהיו לכם שאלות או הערות, אנא כתבו אותם בצ'אט, ואנחנו נשתדל להתייחס למה שנוכל במסגרת הזמן שישאר לנו לקראת הסוף. תודה רבה וניפגש בעוד 10 דקות. Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone. Good evening from Jerusalem. The event will begin in roughly 5 minutes. You are more than invited to turn your cameras on. Regretfully, we cannot permit opening microphones during the event, but if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat room and we'll do our best to answer what we can towards the end. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. שלום וערב טוב לכולם, ברוכים הבאים. האירוע יתחיל בעוד כ5 דקות, אתם בהחלט מוזמנים לפתוח מצלמות. לצערי לא נוכל לאפשר פתיחת מיקרופונים, אבל אם יהיו לכם שאלות או הערות, אנא כתבו אותם בצ'אט, ואנחנו נשתדל להתייחס למה שנוכל במסגרת הזמן שישאר לנו לקראת הסוף. תודה רבה וניפגש בעוד 5 דקות. Welcome everyone and good evening from Jerusalem. The event will begin in just a few more seconds now. You are more than invited to turn your cameras on. Regretfully, we cannot permit opening microphones during the event, but if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat room and we'll do our best to answer what we can towards the end. Thank you very much and enjoy. שלום וערב טוב לכולם, ברוכים הבאים. האירוע יתחיל בעוד כמה שניות, אתם בהחלט מוזמנים לפתוח מצלמות. לצערי לא נוכל לאפשר פתיחת מיקרופונים במהלך האירוע, אבל אם יהיו לכם שאלות או הערות, אנא כתבו אותם בצ'אט, ואנחנו נשתדל להתייחס למה שנוכל במסגרת הזמן שישאר לנו לקראת הסוף. תודה רבה ותהנו. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Samuel Thrope. We're ready to begin.
Hi, hello to everyone, and thanks very much, Doron. Thanks to you all for joining us here, and good evening from Jerusalem. My name is Dr. Samuel Thrope. I'm the curator of the Islam and Middle East collection here at the National Library of Israel. And I am really honored on behalf of the library to welcome Professor Miriam Shefer Mossensohn of Tel Aviv University for this discussion of marking sacred time, an introduction to the Muslim calendar. So this evening is actually one of a series of events that the library has organized in honor of the holy month of Ramadan. And after we conclude our conversation, I encourage you to visit our online events page where you can view previous events related to the Islam and Middle East collection and of course a host of other topics. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this evening's guest speaker. Dr. Shefer Mossensohn is Associate Professor in the Department of Middle East and African History at Tel Aviv University and head of the Tzvi Yazetz School of Historical Studies. A scholar of Ottoman science and medicine, her publications include Ottoman medicine, healing and medical institutions, 1500 to 1700, which was published by the State University of New York Press in 2009, and Science Among the Ottomans, the Cultural Creation and Exchange of Knowledge, published by the University of Texas Press in 2015. Both books, I should say, were also translated into Turkish and published in Turkey. In addition to her more formal academic work, she has also invested a great deal of effort in making the knowledge of Islam accessible to the general public. She published the book Islam, A Brief Introduction in Hebrew in 2006, and has taught the massive open online course, Arab Islamic History from Tribes to Empire, which was taken by thousands of students from around the world. So our event this evening is actually going to be in two parts. First, Professor Shefer Mossensohn is going to give a short introduction to our topic, and then we'll begin a discussion, a conversation between her and myself about calendars, timekeeping, and sacred time. So with that, Miri, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam, and good evening, everyone. I'm here. I'm based not in Jerusalem. I'm not far from Tel Aviv. So good evening, everyone, wherever you are. And it's customary to start with niceties and thank the person who invited me, but I do mean it. And because for me, it's in a very small measure, it's a way to repay the National Library for its continuous support for my research and teaching. So thank you, Sam, for the invitation. By way of introducing our talk today, our conversation about Ramadan, I prepared 5 opening remarks. Some of them might be trivial, but we also need to state the obvious in order to come up with a comprehensive framework for understanding time in general and Islamic time in particular. So 5 points that I would like to suggest as context to our discussion today. Point number 1 is that time is fluid, time is passing. We need only to think of the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland as one example to the perception of time on the move. It's ever dynamic, it's forever gone. Timekeeping is exactly the opposite. The motivation is to capture the moment. Hence, in our discussion today, let's reflect on how timekeeping complements our thinking of time. These are not the same thing. How timekeeping, that is the calendar, allows us to anchor ourselves in time rather than getting lost in time. The second point I would like to raise is that time is glocal. Glocal being the blending of global and local together. I'm not trying to be smart here, but rather I would like to offer a term that allows us to capture the complexity of shaping time as, on the one hand, a universal, global phenomenon, but at the same time, it's also shaped by very much local, unique, and specific aspects. Time measurement and choice of the events to document in a calendar are culturally constructed. They tell us what we want to remember, also what we want to forget. So it's about us rather than a universal or natural occurrence. Point number 3 is that time is abstract. However, the calendar is very practical. It tells us what to do and when to do it. It intrudes into our daily routine. It regulates our intimate behavior down to tiny details, what to eat or when to fast. We are talking about Ramadan, what to dress and when, and so on. So it's really about practicalities. Time tells a story, and this is point number 4, or rather the calendar is shaped by a narrative we want to tell ourselves and others. It may be a very personal story, it can be a family story, or when we think about larger and more comprehensive units, it may be a national narrative or perhaps a religious narrative. In either case, the calendar commemorates defining moments, figures, and sites. The fact that in the Islamic calendar, year 1 is the Hijrah, that is Muhammad's migration from Mecca, where he was born and started receiving revelation, but was also persecuted. His migration from Mecca to Medina, where he was invited as a leader and as a prophet, tells us something about the Islamic perception of a defining moment of religious commencement. And in parentheses, I'll add that the Jewish and Christian choices for year 1 are very different. So this is just one example of many other choices that we make that show us that it is about telling a story about ourselves, who we are, and this story is not just for ourselves, it's also for the others, in a way to show who we are and what we are not. The 5th and last point is religious time is sacred. I mean that religious time or religious calendar attaches sacred meaning to time and dates as it commemorates the relationship of the believers with the divine. Returning again to the Islamic calendar and year 1, although it has to do with Muhammad's career, his biography, the Islamic historical awareness situate Muhammad and Islam in a narrative that goes back to divine creation of the world. In other words, history is the history of God's involvement and impact in this world in various degrees, measures, and means. And the calendar is one of the ways in which we remind ourselves of that history of divine involvement in our world. These are 5 points, just 5 points. We will, as we go on in our discussion, we'll obviously include many more issues and aspects, but I wanted to start with these as suggestions for relevant context to use for us as we think about Islamic calendar in general and Ramadan in particular. And Sam, perhaps you want to take us from here to our next stage in our conversation?
Okay, I'm happy to, and thanks so much again. It's great to be talking with you. And we've never met in person yet, but in the online space, everything is possible. So what I loved about your introduction actually is that the emphasis you placed on time as cultural, meaning time as a cultural construction in Islam and in every other culture. I think I want to start actually by talking about year one that you just mentioned, the Hijrah of the Prophet and the role that plays. Because as we know, our discussion is happening just at the end of Ramadan, just as this month draws to a close. And one of the things that Ramadan celebrates is precisely the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. Ramadan, as you know, is also mentioned in the Quran itself. So as we talk, and as our discussion continues, I want to take the opportunity that's presented with us to show some related items from our Islamic manuscript collection, just to sort of give us some context and some visual, a visual aspect to this event. So I'm going to share my screen, and this will just be up as we continue talking. Give me 1 second here. There, is that visible?
Yes.
Great. So, so this is a manuscript from our collection. As I said, it is a 16th century Quran, one of my own favorite Qurans, actually, because it was copied for the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. And what you see here in front of you is the opening carpet page of this Quran and the opening surah. It's a beautifully illuminated copy. And here, actually, is the verse from the second surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, that refers to the holiday of that refers to Ramadan. So Ramadan is connected to the Quran. It's connected to the revelation of the Quran. Ramadan itself is mentioned in the Quran. And yet, there are some scholars who have said that the fast of Ramadan also has pre-Islamic roots. So I'm curious to hear you sort of give us some context for what that really means. How can a Muslim holiday be related to something that comes before Islam? And in general, how does the current calendar that we have today relate to the traditions of Arabia that preceded the Prophet Muhammad?
Okay, right. The Islamic calendar is very much Islamic. It celebrates year one, Muhammad's revelation. It celebrates various events and dates related to Islamic belief and practice. But as you said, at the same time, it also includes or alludes to the history of Islam and its pre-Islamic layers. You mentioned pre-Islamic Arabia, and this is a very important layer. I think we should also mention Judaism and Christianity, which we'll mention also later on, but exactly at this point, because we want to focus at least for a bit about Arabia and pre-Islamic Arabia, it is important to understand that while the Islamic calendar is very much Islamic, it's about Islamic narrative, it's about Islamic perception, it's about Islamic beliefs and rituals. Within it, we see also its history, and it's not necessarily that hidden. Let's talk about Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, the fact that this is the 9th month, the fact that its name is Ramadan. There are many scholars who claim that what we see with regard to Ramadan is something that we see in general in various aspects of Islam. We see how the early Muslims took beliefs and customs. They were part of their everyday pre-Islamic realities, took them, changed them, continued. At the same time, also brought about a rupture with their past. So they took the name of the month, Ramadan, that was apparently also part of the pre-Islamic calendar. They took it. They continue to use it. It's also the 9th months. So in that regard, there is a continuity in the calendar, but the context or the meaning of Ramadan is now totally different, because now what Ramadan is all about is about fast. It's about the relationship between Muslims and God, not Arabs, but Muslims who may be Arabs, but most of them, of course, are not Arabs. And this is just one aspect of a much wider phenomenon that we see all over Islamic beliefs and customs. Just to illustrate another example, the name of the month. We assume that the name is derived from a root in Arabic, which meaning has to do with to raise, with the verb to raise. And the explanation, the usual explanation we find is that in the pre-Islamic months perhaps had to do with the season when animals were raised, female animals were, for example, she-camels were in calf, and their tails were raised. So this is an example how Ramadan, which, as you said, appears in the Quran, is infused with Islamic meaning, but also carries a memory of its pre-Islamic Arabian history. And you could ask, why did they do this? Why did they bother to continue this perhaps undesired history? Because we know that the very basic notion of of its pre-Islamic area was that of Jahiliyyah, a term that denotes a period that had to be ended because it was a period of ignorance, religious and moral ignorance. And Muhammad's mission was exactly that, to terminate this black period. When a Muslim says, when a believer says today Jahiliyyah, he does more, she or he do more than just refer to a historical period. What they do is they say that this is a period that has a moral judgment, and this is in a very strong term to show how today Muslims are displeased with that period of ignorance. So for many reasons, Muslims, the early Muslims, at least from this point of view, perhaps they could better served by erasing all memory of pre-Islamic calendar, rituals, perceptions, and so on, and we don't see it. What we see is how they take certain things from their past, continue them by, let's say, translating them into a new Islamic context. And one of the examples is the month of Ramadan. They returned the name, they retained its position within the calendar, but the content is totally different. It's now very, very much one of the unique features of an Islamic calendar.
Thanks so much for that. What's really interesting to me is that it seems like that paradigm, let's say, is true not just for the content of the month of Ramadan, let's say, but even for the fixing of the dates in the calendar itself, right? I mean, I think if anyone, you know, who's not a scholar trained in the field knows, or a believer themselves knows about Ramadan, is that it's calculated, or we calculate the beginning by actually observing the moon, right? Not just by not by mathematically figuring out the dates or through some kind of system, but actually people have to go out and look and see when when the month begins by observation. And that in itself was something that was decided upon by the Prophet Muhammad when he said that we're not going to have an intercalation system as we do in Judaism, and which also has a lunar calendar, but adds a month every few years. And sort of what that means in part, and we can talk about Judaism and Christianity as we go forward, and I'm sure we will, but what that means in part is that astronomy, right, the observation of the heavens, the observation of the moon, and even beyond that, the stars and the night sky in general, is a central part of the Islamic calendar. And what I wanted to ask you in that front is sort of, in what way in what way has the calendar intersected with and also inspired the development of scientific thought within Islam?
Right. I mean, if one cannot rely on previous calculations, but each generation, each month needs to observe the beginning of the moon in order to determine that a new month starts. That in itself is a great drive for various branches of sciences. Astronomy is an obvious choice, but also various branches of mathematics, like geometry, trigonometry, arithmetics. We could also talk about astrology as another branch of science that received boost because of the need to observe celestial bodies in order to determine the Islamic calendar. And we see it throughout the generations that, in fact, a lot of people, now don't ask me about numbers because we don't have numbers, but we get a sense from the sources that a lot of people were quite knowledgeable about aspects of astronomy. Perhaps not all of them were professional astronomers, but in order to be just an observant Muslim, a regular observant Muslim, not a scholar, not a professional, but to be your everyday regular observant, you need to know something. So we know from the sources, or at least get a sense from the sources, that certain branches of science, especially those related to the Islamic calendar, were quite popular, were quite widespread, which of course raised an interesting question with the advent of modern science, when now we have the measurements, now we have the equipment, we can calculate in advance exactly when Ramadan will occur 10 years from now, 100 years from now. But during the 19th century and early 20th century, when that question was posed before the ulama, the religious scholars, they had to decide whether to return the older school of manual observation, or to allow the new science to take over. And interestingly enough, they come up with a sort of a balance or a combination. So the equipment is there as a measurement aid, but still the ritual of manually observe the moon in order to determine and officially announce that Ramadan is starting, they return this ritual, and every year millions and millions of Muslims look at a special committee in Saudi Arabia, waiting to hear officially that Ramadan is starting. Although they know, because they have the calendar, it's not Ramadan till the committee says so.
that that there's a weaving together or between observation and the calendar, right? We can Google the date of Ramadan, or we can Google right now the date of Eid al-Fitr, which would be in just tomorrow. But the observation is a central part of it, as you're saying. There's I'm thinking of the related issue of determining the direction of prayer, right? Is just the same thing where in the Middle Ages, it involved an incredible amount of calculation and observation, geometry, astronomy. And I think we often forget how central that was, as you were saying, to that sort of scientific calculation, to the life of every observant believer. It makes me think of when we're talking about the calendar and we're talking about the scientific aspects of it. I want to mention the name of an individual who's, I think, beyond question, one of the most important and most influential Muslim thinkers in history, who is, of course, the famous 11th century scientist, philosopher, religious scholar, polymath, really, who dealt in so many fields, Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. He wrote extensively about astronomy, mathematics, and numerous other disciplines. And one of his most famous works touches on the topic that we're dealing with tonight, the chronology of ancient nations, which, as you know, is a work that, among many other things, compares the Muslim calendar, the Hijri calendar, with Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, Sabian, Indian, and a whole host of timekeeping systems. And the book also discusses the history and customs of these various groups. So I want to, in our collection, we don't actually have a manuscript of this book, but I've taken the liberty of looking at the University of Edinburgh collection, where the oldest manuscript of Biruni's work is found. So here, this copy, which is from the early 14th century, copied in Iran, which was not long after Biruni himself lived. So what you see in this illustration here is, it looks like the Adam and Eve story, but it's actually from the ancient Iranian creation myth of the first two human beings, Masha and Mashiani, the first human couple being tempted by Ahriman, the evil spirit. And this whole copy of manuscript is filled with amazing and really wonderful miniatures just like these. So the thing I wanted to ask you is that Biruni's work demonstrates that Muslim scholars knew about other timekeeping systems, Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, etc. So how did these multiple systems sort of fit together? Were people keeping, following the religious calendar, but also were aware of other calendars, a kind of secular calendar, as we might put it, or were they only following one or the other? Or sort of, can you give us a better picture of how this actually worked in practice?
Right. Perhaps we can share with the audience that as we prepared for this conversation, we wondered whether we want to include al-Biruni in our conversation, and I have to confess, I was the skeptic one, and I wondered whether we should talk about him, because, as you said, he was such a polymath, so he was a unique figure. And whenever we talk about unique figure, that's exactly it. I mean, he's peculiar, he's unique, he's so different from everyone else. And the fact that he was really interested, really interested in other civilization, in other cultures, in other systems of sciences. Many of my colleagues in the East Asian department regard him as the first modern Indologist. he was unique, that not that many people like him. So I was wondering whether we shouldn't talk about him. But the manuscript that you just showed us reveals that although he was unique, other Muslims in all over the Muslim world were interested in what he had to say. The fact is that his treatises were copied many times, including very well illustrated. So the bottom line is, I think that you're right to bring him up in this conversation. So you were right, I'm wrong. Now, talking about multiplicity of calendars, the fact that there were several calendars, that people were aware of calendars, and we can use Al-Biruni to talk about several kinds of multiple calendars. Al-Biruni gives us example of his interest in previous calendars of ancient civilizations, Zoroastrians, Indian, Buddhist, and so on. But there was also another kind of phenomenon, which I think is even more interesting. The fact that here in the Middle East and in many other places in the Muslim world, different religious communities lived side by side. So by definition, people knew or had to know other calendars. In the Middle East, it's not unique to see houses with several stories. The first story is a Jewish family. The second story is a Christian family. The third floor is a Muslim family. It sounds like the beginning of a joke. No, it's reality. People live together. So they got to know each other, routine, practices, rituals, including calendars. The same, another aspect of this living together phenomenon is that people knew about other rituals, what is kosher in the Jewish sense, in the Muslim sense, and so on. So I think that people were quite sophisticated and you knew what it means to live according to several calendars at the same time. Here in Israel, we take it for granted that we live according to two calendars. We have the Jewish calendar and the general calendar. It's something, it's a skill that everyone from kindergarten grows up with. I think this is something that here in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world, because of different communities from different faiths had to live together, they also knew about different calendars. Sometimes these calendars coincide, sometimes they collide. Either way, people knew how to translate their calendar with another community's calendar.
So I want to go back to the 5 points that you raised at the beginning of our conversation, and you talked about the cultural construct of the calendar, right? And that what it reveals about a culture and the way that time is divided, the way that time is apportioned, the way that the sacred is thought about. So I want to ask you more in that direction. You know, every religious tradition has its own calendar, has its own way of marking time. So what does, and maybe when you answer, you can also talk about the shape of the sacred year as a whole. What does the Hijri calendar, what does the Islamic calendar reveal about Islam?
Wow, that's a very big question. I don't think we have enough time to really do justice to this question, but let me point to perhaps some clues or some leads go to think about that in later on. The fact that, okay, we are at the end of Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr is about to start. When we look at the Islamic calendar and count how many holidays, big holidays, are included in the calendar, it's interesting to note that there are not that many. Certainly when we compare it to the Jewish calendar or the Christian calendar, we have in the Islamic calendar only two holidays, only two big holidays. One is Eid al-Fitr, which is about to start, and the other one is Eid al-Adha, that is immediately after the Hajj, after the pilgrimage. It's interesting to see that the mindset, the mentality that a community is organized upon is made of several important events like Ramadan, like the pilgrimage, like other important dates, but not so many festivals and happy occasions. I think it's interesting to see that kind of a choice, which perhaps explains why we see an evolution in the Islamic calendar, why there are originally only two major holidays, but later on, when we move on from the early first Islamic centuries, we move on to the later medieval period, we see a third important holiday coming into the calendar, and I refer to Mawlid al-Nabi, the festival that celebrates the birth of Muhammad. The fact that, well, as a historian, the fact that there is a new major holiday, of course, is a fascinating historical phenomenon. But for the point that we are discussing now, the fact that the new date that was entered into the calendar was a festival, a happy festival. The fact that the community, there was a silent consensus that what we as a community, what we miss or what we want to add to the calendar is a festival. I think it's a very interesting observation to think about its meaning. I'm not sure that I have a good answer why this is it. I mean, I'm a historian. I have no background in psychology, and perhaps this is something that could perhaps be explored from that angle. But I think it tells us something about consensus, about the community, about how the community constructs itself, how the community chooses to come together, on what kind of occasions the community wants to gather together as a community to celebrate itself, to celebrate the Ummah, the Islamic nation. So we have Ramadan, we have on Fridays, we have the noon prayer in mosques, we have the pilgrimage, we have only two, as I said, only two holidays that come after physical hardship. Eid al-Fitr comes after a whole month of fasting. So the holiday comes after a very long and difficult and tiring month. Also Eid al-Adha that comes after the pilgrimage, which is not an easy process. If we go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, it's a very tiring process. You need to keep to a timetable in order to accomplish all the rituals that need to be performed during the pilgrimage. And only after that, one reaches the holiday. And now with the addition of Mawlid al-Nabi, the fast that celebrates the birth of Prophet Muhammad, it's really a very happy occasion because it's just about that occasion. So I think it's interesting to see that kind of choices that the community as a community chooses to do. And again, this tells us something about Islam and its perceptions of itself. Here I gave the examples from the social point of view. This is something that the calendar tells us.
Yeah, that's so interesting also because it points to the fact that Islam is dynamic and changing and far from static and far from rigid. So I wanted to ask you also, as an expert on the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman culture, and it's with the Ottomans, with the Ottoman period, that we really see the confrontation between Islam and modernity, if I can put it in those terms. So how did the calendar react if in change and take a new form also in that period?
I could perhaps talk not about the calendar, but about timekeeping, and remind ourselves, certainly in Israel, of clock towers, the phenomena that we see all over the Ottoman Empire, from the Balkans to North Africa, and of course it's very much present also here in Israel, the phenomenon of clock tower. We have one in Jaffa, we used to have one in Jerusalem, and so on. The clock tower, the clock in the clock tower is fascinating because it is a Western type of clock. It envisions a unit that starts at midnight and ends at midnight, and we have each hour has exact 60 minutes, and each minute has exact 60 seconds, and so on, which is very different from the Islamic units, because the Islamic day, like the Jewish day, starts on sunset. And the fact that late 19th century, early 20th century, the Ottoman Middle East takes on that kind of concrete, universal timekeeping, but at the same time returns its Islamic calendar, is the combination that for them was the solution for tradition and modernity. How they change, because they wanted to change, they perceive themselves as up and coming with the times, as very much modern. And like today, we are modern if we have the latest gadget and so on. So the latest gadget in the late 19th century and early 20th century is a clock, to be exact, to be effective. So they take that. They take that because they want that as a status symbol for modernity, because they also thought about that kind of clock as a way to show to the world that they were modernized and westernized like everyone else, very much a developed nation, a developed civilization. But they didn't want to lose their tradition. So how do we do that? Their solution was, okay, let's take the clock, but at the same time, we observe the traditional Islamic calendar, and we continue to observe that kind of calendar in the traditional ways of measurement. So I think it's a very interesting combination, which also speaks about another phenomenon that we have mentioned before, the fact that people used to live and still do by observing several kinds of calendars at the same time. I think this is another example of that phenomenon.
Right. It seems to be like living in multiple times at once, in a way.
Yes.
And I love that example because I've seen the clock tower in Jaffa and visited there numerous times, and it does stand out as a monumental structure, really, a monument of and a statement of what it means to be, of what the the ruling powers at the time wanted to demonstrate and wanted to show the populace and the world. So someone just asked a question I saw, which was actually the next thing that I wanted to ask you. We talked about, or you mentioned Mawlid al-Nabi, this innovative third holiday that becomes part of the ritual year in the early Middle Ages. And even though most Muslims celebrate it, not all do, right? There are different communities, the Sunni and the Shia mark different days as the Prophet's birthday, and some communities choose not to celebrate at all, which I think is another example of different sort of calendars and different times living in conjunction and living in parallel. But the question is sort of how do these different communities' calendars interact, and how do they share the space, as it were, or the time?
Oh, I have to go into. Okay.
We understand. So yeah, please go. So for everyone who's listening and watching, as you know, we're in a tense period here, and Miriam unfortunately had a rocket siren warning, so had to take a break, and it gives me the opportunity to say that we hope for better, calmer, and peaceful times for everyone here in the region soon. While she's waiting to come back, I want to say that the experience of investigating the Muslim calendar and sort of seeing the calendar and the holidays through the prism of our collections is actually really amazing. I recommend everyone to, when you get a chance, to visit the National Library of Israel website, and to check out the pages that we have about Islam and about the calendar. There's very interesting stuff, and we've collected some of the material from our collections there for you to see. So I'm going to take this opportunity to turn to some of the questions. And maybe we'll start while waiting for Mary to come back. We'll talk about a question that Isaac asked about why the Islamic calendar is not adjusted to the solar calendar like the Jewish and Chinese, I didn't know that's true, but like the Jewish and Chinese calendars are. So again, the issue is intercalation. The lunar year is 12 months and shorter actually than the solar year, just a few days shorter. So every year the lunar calendar, be it Jewish or Muslim or whatever, loses time as compared to the solar calendar. So the way that the Jewish tradition has figured out to solve this issue is to add a month every few years, a leap month, and then the two calendars align. So the question of why the Prophet Muhammad, who made this decision, chose not to include intercalation in the Muslim calendar, I'll maybe leave to Miri. But one possible answer is like you said before, like we had said, precisely to differentiate between Jewish and Christian calendars and the calendar of the early Muslim community, and also to put observation front and center, that it becomes a matter of the individual or the scholar sort of seeing the moon and determining on that basis when Ramadan, for instance, begins, and rather than like other communities relying on a calculated calendar. So I can turn to maybe the question that we had just discussed about the Mawlid. And there are communities, as we said, in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Arabian Peninsula that don't celebrate Mawlid al-Nabi, the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, precisely because it is relatively new. It's not a holiday that was instituted by the Prophet himself in his lifetime. And not only that, traditionally the celebrations of the Mawlid involve music, involve poems that were performed celebrating the Prophet Muhammad, celebrating his life, narratives of his birth. And because certain communities see these traditions, welcome back, Miri. I hope everything is okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mentioned to the audience before that we're in the midst of a difficult time here. So I'm glad to hear that you're safe and back.
Yeah. The siren was on, but now it's safe. Okay, it's again. Sorry. Apparently, sorry, the siren is on again.
I think so. We can maybe open microphones and have people address any kind of questions they might have that they haven't written in. So the microphones are open.
Okay.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I just have one small question. You mentioned the different Islamic communities have different starting points and they count time a little bit different. And I was just wondering about why there's this 1 day difference between the Shiites of Iran and the Sunnis, because basically for them there's a small difference of 1 day, but I actually don't know why. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. And I'll say at the outset that I can, I'll do my best to answer what I can, and the rest I will leave for Miri, and maybe we can find an opportunity to bring her back to answer the remainder of the questions. I think the calendar traditions and the dates of holidays really developed over the course of time and depended on different scholars and different communities sort of deciding amongst themselves when holidays begin and when they and the dates for each. And because there are so many differing traditions within Islam, sort of the Shia communities coalesced around a certain date, for example, for the Mawlid, and Sunni communities coalesced around a different date. I think there's not a particular explanation other than that the two different traditions have over time sort of gathered around these various points. Right. So Yusuf, I see you're raising your hand, please.
Yes, I could answer a few of the questions because this is my research topic. The names of the months seem to reflect some seasonal activity when there was some intercalation. As far as I know, the Ramadan actually refers to a scorching dry heat, while Shawwal is due to the raising of the tails of the camels during the breeding season. So that's the names of the months seem to refer to a time when there was intercalation and some correlation of the seasons. The Shia harmonized the birthday of the Prophet with the events relating to the Imams. So they will coincide. But In Islamic tradition, they admitted that they really didn't know there was a controversy about the exact day of the birth of the prophet, and that was one of the objections Muslim scholars had to celebrating Mawlid al-Nabi. And why is Mawlid al-Nabi celebrated? Well, that's to borrow from Protestants, adding bells and whistles to satisfy people.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sam.
Thank you very much.
I think we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doron, and thanks to everyone. I'm sorry that we lost Miri, but thanks to everyone who participated, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a great evening.